The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Good afternoon and welcome to AIRMIC's second in a series of 5 webinars on the topic of digital transformation. My name is Kim Lee and I am Research and Development Manager at AIRMIC, and I'll be setting the scene for today's webinar. I'm pleased to introduce our presenter for the day, Tim Stapleton, who is Senior Vice President, Cyber Insurance Product Manager and Information Technology Practice Leader at Chubb. Following last week's introductory webinar, which sets the scene for digital transformation and introduced 3 technologies that contribute to this transformation, Tim will focus specifically on one of those technologies, the Internet of Things. Tim will discuss the benefits of the Internet of Things and the biggest risks that corporates need to look out for. Before I hand over to Tim, I have a few housekeeping announcements to make. As ever with our webinars, this is an interactive seminar, and you are all invited to join the discussion and ask questions anytime throughout the course of today's webinar. You can do this via the GoToWebinar control panel, which is located to the right of your screen. Just scroll down to the question tab, type your question in the allocated box, and submit your question by selecting Send Privately. If you cannot see your GoToWebinar control panel anytime throughout this webinar, please click on the orange arrow on the right of your screen. I will pose your questions to Tim as and when they are submitted. We'll also be polling you during the course of the webinar and presenting the results straight away, so please do participate. And lastly, this presentation can be downloaded on the Handouts tab via your GoToWebinar control panel. That's all from me. Tim, it's over to you.
All right, thanks very much, Ken. Hi, everyone. It's great to be here with you today. As Ken mentioned, I'm going to be talking about the Internet of Things. And so really what I'm going to focus on are some practical elements and takeaways for risk managers, and covering 3 main areas here. So in the introductory phase, I'm just going to go through what is the Internet of Things, or what is IoT, and give you some practical examples of how the technology is actually used day to day in practical settings. Then we'll go through some benefits to companies and use functions specific to certain industries, and then we'll talk at the very end about the risks that IoT technology poses to organizations and some things that risk managers are going to have to consider when implementing IoT tech within the organization. So what is the Internet of Things? Many of you have heard the term, and you've undoubtedly used IoT technology, whether you're aware of it or not. So I'm going to start with a pretty high-level technical explanation here, but my goal is to give you some practical examples to bring it into focus throughout the next 30 minutes or so. There's going to be some technical elements to this that we can't necessarily avoid, but I hope to keep the discussion relatively straightforward. So simply put, the Internet of Things is a network of internet-connected objects that are able to collect and exchange data with one another, and then also with a data platform that sits behind it. So another way to describe this is the internetworking of physical devices. So just to give you some basic history in the short time that we have, the early stages of the Internet focus primarily on relationships between people and things, or people and devices. With IoT, the relationships now have shifted to things, or devices talking or communicating with other devices against the backdrop of a technology platform and certain applications. So these devices are embedded with electronics, with software, sensors, actuators, network connectivity that then enable them to collect and exchange data. On the network or the data platform that sits behind it, you have apps that can conduct machine learning or artificial intelligence. You have data analytics functions. You have complex rule generation, and you have automated orchestration of actions, which leads to a lot of efficiency within organizations, which can be a huge benefit. Each one of these things is uniquely identifiable through its embedded computing system, but it's able to interoperate within the existing Internet infrastructure. So that's somewhat technical, so I lied at the beginning when I said I wasn't going to be technical, but let me give you a practical example here in the context of cars and automobiles. All right, so by 2020, Gartner predicts that there will be 250 million connected cars on the road with IoT technology. Right? So cars embedded with IoT technology can effectively communicate with other IoT-enabled devices to create a number of lifestyle efficiencies for the owner. So in a very simple example, your car can tell your IoT-enabled home to turn the lights on and start your home heating or cooling system as you actually approach the house. And it does this through the use of geospatial sensor technology, which we're going to talk a little bit about in more detail later. So within the car, the computer is also monitoring vehicle performance in real time. So in the past, the check engine light would trigger based on the data provided by a sensor. Now the computer is actually connected to a number of different areas through a pathway. So not only will the check engine light go on, but the car sends a message to the platform that the manufacturer has built applications on that serve specific functions. So one of these functions might be to monitor parts that are available in a warehouse. It might send a message to the owner's smartphone or to the car itself, alerting the driver that they need to replace a specific part. It might also direct them to the closest service station, and the app might also include part ordering or tracking functionality. And then on the other side, at the manufacturer, you have access to the data from thousands of other vehicles that feed into the same platform. So they analyze that to make design upgrades based on patterns that they might spot. So if other drivers or owners have similar issues, for instance, that all feeds into the platform and they can spot that trend and adjust accordingly. So you can see how this could lead to much greater efficiency for both the manufacturer and the consumer. And you can also see why there's a major investment in IoT with a number of transactions that have already occurred in the past year or so, the largest of which was Google's purchase of Nest for around 3.2 billion US dollars. Small startups, though, are also being targeted and purchased by some of the large globals, and that trend is expected to continue into 2017 as more companies start to invest in what they see as a major opportunity to enhance their products or collect data in mass quantities that in the past was just not possible. So when people talk about the Internet of Things, you can see why they talk about this as being as transformative, if not more so, than the Industrial Revolution. So where is the Internet of Things actually used? In a personal context, you can see that there's a short list here, and this list can go on, but some of the practical applications are within smartphones. That's the obvious area, but wearable devices like Fitbit bracelets, your thermostat in your house, garage door openers, home security, even your sprinkler system can be IoT connected. Scales, so you can have digital scales that have IoT technology embedded that can give you advice and diet tips if you want. I would turn that function off. You also have keychains, you have lights, you have even textiles and clothing that to some degree can have an element of IoT. In a commercial setting, there's manufacturing, construction, transportation applications, and all these different industries, so agricultural, healthcare, oil, gas. And we're going to talk in a little bit more detail about the specific applications within those industries in just a few minutes. But these are some areas where there's an immediate need and an ongoing use of IoT tech. So looking at all these different applications, you can start to see where there's a relationship with big data. Right? So companies find that information being taken from IoT is quite valuable in contributing to product and service improvements, which is why there's such, again, a big investment in this area. So how does IoT actually work? If we're looking on the grid here, we have sensor technology. So IoT is effectively a mix of hardware and software components. So I mentioned before there's a networking platform component to this. That could be cloud-based. It may not be. It could be privately owned. But again, there's a network that sits behind this, and a platform as well as applications. So you have that software issue. But there's also a hardware component to this, and that consists of sensors and beacons and other electronics. So when we look at what are sensors and what can they actually do, sensors are crucial, right, in the chain here in how IoT actually works. They're tiny motors that detect movement or changes in the environment. And you can see from this chart all the different functionality that sensors can provide. So some of them can tell position, presence, and proximity. Some can tell when you're actually in the room. You have motion and velocity, displacement. Some detect temperature changes or changes in the humidity or moisture environments. Some will detect chemical and gas. Some can detect leaks and levels, acceleration, magnetic fields, and then optical or ambient light. So you can see kind of in the spectrum, there's a number of different uses for sensor technology and different types of sensors. Now, when we're looking at investment in sensors by geography, you can get a sense of what countries or what regions in this case are really looking to IoT, right, and the build out and investment in companies. So companies that were surveyed by PwC in a survey called Sensing the Future of the Internet of Things, you can see that there's a pretty decent spread across all regions as far as the investment is concerned. But then when we take a look at the investment in sensor technology by industry, you can see that most of it is in the energy, mining, power utilities, and then automotive sectors, industrial as well, and then there's a little bit of a drop-off, but still to the extent that financial institutions, technology, entertainment industry is looking at this, there's still a big investment going on. But as we talk about some of the practical applications in just a few minutes, I think you'll see why that will come into focus as to why those top 3 or 4 industries are where they are on the spectrum there. So at this point, I'm going to pause and I'm going to turn it over to Kin, who's going to go through our first polling question.
Okay, so before we move on to consider the benefits of the Internet of Things, it's over to you, the audience, for your views via a short poll. So what is the estimated number of devices that make up the Internet of Things? If you can make your selection now. And we'll just give you a few more seconds to make your choice before we share the results. Okay, so Tim, as you can see, we've got 30% who believe it's 40 to 50 billion, and the vast majority, 70%, believe it's 6 to 10 billion. What is the real answer?
Wow. Well, now I'm intimidated because I know a lot of you have been doing your homework out there. The real answer is between 6 and 10 billion is the estimated number of current devices that are actually out that have some sort of IoT functionality. I think for the folks who answered in the first column there, the up to 50 billion, you may have been listening to some of the reports and some of the statements that were being made by the heads of several large technology companies, throwing those numbers around and talking about where the industry is going to go by the year 2020. That actually was the original estimate of where we would be as far as the number of IoT devices by 2020 was 50 billion. But we're not really close to that at the moment. And since then, the most current has been dialed back. So by 2020, the more realistic and recent estimates are that we'd be around 28 to 30 billion IoT devices in existence by the year 2020. But at the moment, it's between 6 and 9. So again, if you compare that to, let's say, the world's population, that far exceeds actually the number of people that are on this planet at the moment. And you can see that, again, there are benefits, but as we're going to talk about in the later portion of this, there are a lot of inherent risks that come along with that as well, and having that many devices out there, especially with regard to security and privacy issues that could crop up.
Well, certainly more and more businesses are looking to use more Internet of Things within their operations. So it's not, they're very much seeing the benefits to it.
Absolutely.
Perhaps not so much the risks.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think if we look at that and the benefits by in general to companies in using IoT, there's no surprises here. I mean, it improves quality of life. It accelerates data capture and analysis. You have greater production efficiency and accuracy. It can lead to safer working environments. It can improve healthcare experience. If we're looking at the healthcare industry, and it reduces human interaction. That could be a plus or a minus depending on whether you're in a product or a service-related industry. But again, from a headcount perspective, from a costing and an expense perspective, that ultimately should help bring cost and expense downward. So we'll take a few minutes and walk through some of the practical applications specific to industries that you see here, starting with energy and mining. So just in the context of the energy and mining industry, a couple of examples of how IoT is used. You have IoT sensors that are used to monitor and detect dangerous levels of carbon monoxide levels that are in mines, and it can also be used to improve workplace efficiency. Within the power and utilities sector, you have internet-connected smart meters that measure power usage in short intervals, and then they provide feedback not only to the power consumer but also to the power company. So some of these areas actually have the ability to automatically adjust the system parameters based on usage patterns. So you can see how that would be of value to both sides, because again, going back to the tracking capabilities, it allows the power company to start spotting patterns and then reducing overall usage based on the true real-time need. Within automotive, we talked about this a little bit, but beyond the example I gave, IoT is used in hands-free driving. You have traffic pattern optimization, you have accident avoidance, engine diagnostics, even for your entertainment system automation, communicating with the manufacturers and local service shops. And then it also enables smart parking, and in a commercial context, you can start talking about more efficient fleet management and road assistance. Just looking at a few more industries like manufacturing, healthcare, and retail. In manufacturing, you have a few different areas here. Manufacturers are using this for, on the one hand, network control and management of actual equipment. They're also using it for asset and situation management, and they're using it, thirdly, for manufacturing process control. So you have IoT intelligence systems that are used for dynamic response to product demands and real-time optimization of manufacturing production, and also to manage supply chain networks. And then you also have automation of some operator tools that is used to improve plant safety. And then in terms of the asset management angle, it can enable real-time data collection for statistical evaluation and even for predictive maintenance. So you can see again how that creates efficiencies and safer working environment. Healthcare sensors are used to remotely monitor patient vital signs and transmit to shared systems where doctors and providers can actually access and recommend action as necessary. Sometimes these are tied into emergency notification systems. The basic level devices that they have out there at the moment can measure heart rate and blood pressure, and then some hospitals actually have smart beds that they've implemented where these beds can detect when they're actually occupied by a patient, and they can adjust to ensure appropriate pressure and support is applied to the patient without the manual interaction of nurses. So you look at the strain on the healthcare system in certain countries where use of technology like this, again, could be potentially life-saving and cut down on the stress and the strain on the healthcare system. Within the retail context, you have product and shelf sensors. Most of this is being used to track consumer behavior, right? So tracking what people buy, but also to effectively track inventory throughout the supply chain. Stores can manage their inventory flow, but they can also then customize marketing campaigns to enhance the user experience. Okay, so you may be sitting there asking, so we are about to embark on the use of IoT. I'm considering using it for my organization, maybe for one of the things that I mentioned before, maybe for something a little bit different. However, we don't know how to go about showing the actual or tangible return on investment that IoT can bring to the organization. So in doing some research here, there was a 2016 CRN survey. About 85% of solution providers said they're currently deriving revenue from IoT solutions, with about 49% saying that IoT represents a meaningful or a huge opportunity for them over the next 18 months. So it's clearly being pushed, but quantifying the tangible return on investment remains a challenge. The question is actually a bit more nuanced than simply asking, how do we quantify the return from IoT? Before you actually consider the elements that form part of that answer, like the initial upfront investment, the impact on operational efficiency, and then ultimately the bottom line, you have to look at the different ways in which IoT can actually be deployed throughout the organization. So you think about that in the context of your business. How much of a challenge are you going to have in moving forward with new initiatives unless you can clearly show the benefit to the key stakeholders and the folks who are going to provide you with the funding ultimately? As much hype and buzz as there is around this, there's a collective opinion that the inability to show tangible ROI has actually slowed the growth trajectory here of implementing the technology. IoT typically involves multifaceted systems, incorporated machine learning, data analytics. So there are alternatives to full platform IoT deployments that can in some cases demonstrate return. So Jerry Chase, the individual who came up with this methodology, actually was looking at the traditional way of implementation, which is platform first. So this is really implementing IoT technology at the enterprise level, which requires some level of standardization across the enterprise to build applications onto the platform and then potentially integrate other enterprise systems and ingest device data. And then you would focus on IoT use cases that benefit the business and then presumably generate the ROI. But you can see where the initial investment up front would be much greater than if we look at maybe an alternative, which we'll look at in just a second. And then deploying emerging technology at the enterprise level obviously carries a much greater degree of risk, and the time commitment is longer around that methodology. Whereas if you went to a use case first, which is looking at initial production deployment of IoT technology related to individual business initiatives. So these are not necessarily viewed as IoT initiatives. These are viewed as something that IoT could help to create efficiency around. So the focus here should be on driving specific business outcomes. And there's multiple benefits where organizations can discover that data generated by some of these distributed devices can then be analyzed and used to automatically drive business process in addition to producing return on investment. So there's a longer term impact obviously here. So the challenges though in this methodology is that it may result in dissimilar systems being deployed in different parts of the organization, which becomes a bit of a headache for the IT folks. And then it's also difficult to track and manage risk in a decentralized environment for you as risk managers. So that's something to think about because again, this is a little bit more of a disparate way of going about deployment, but again, something that you can likely show ROI in a much faster period of time. Okay, so I think from here, I'd like to go on to our second poll question. I'm going to kick it back over to Kin for that.
Okay, so before we move on, it's again over to you to answer this question. What is the biggest risk associated with using the Internet of Things within your organization? You can make your choices now, and we'll give you about 30 seconds. Okay, we're about to share the results of the poll. If you haven't made your choice just yet, now would be a good time. So Tim, just looking at the results here, we've got the vast majority, 77%, selecting security as their biggest risk compared to only 15%, which is the minority, selecting reputational risk. Does that surprise you?
Only to the extent that I'm used to talking about cyber in general, and in the context of cyber and cyber risk, which a lot of folks usually associate IoT with, they tend to look at reputational as the biggest risk within the organization to implementing cyber and looking at cyber exposures generally. Here, I'm not that surprised because we're talking specifically about IoT, especially given a lot of the public issues that have occurred over the past year, and some things that have come to light with regard to the security protocol, or the lack thereof, actually, that exists within IoT technology, or that is embedded in devices. I'm going to talk a little bit about each one of these areas in a little bit more detail, and we're going to go into the examples. But around security, I think there's a very good example that we'll talk about, unless there's some questions that are coming in.
Well, considering that the vast majority have selected security as their biggest risk, what are the exposures connected with the IoT in terms of security being a major threat? Well,
the number one issue now with IoT devices or enabled devices is that there's a perception and a reality to some extent that devices do not have the level of security that would be required otherwise within an actual network framework. So, for example, we saw one of the largest denial of service attacks last year that's ever taken place against a domain name service provider called DIN. So effectively, a DDoS attack, as a DNS provider, DIN routed an internet user to the appropriate server for a connection, like a switchboard. Right? DIN was the victim of this distributed denial of service attack, where an overwhelming number of IoT-enabled devices were used in a botnet to attack it and basically overwhelm it with capacity to the point where it got shut down for an extended period of time. And so the malware that was used in this attack not only took over computers, but it actually was able to take over IoT devices like cameras, like baby monitors. Routers were actually probably the number one issue, but you can see where, going beyond computers, somebody figured out, you know what, there's this entire network out there of internet-connected devices that we can use to magnify the attack and the severity of the attack against this organization. And they also, the other sort of factor that compounded the situation was that as a DNS, DIN had so much traffic going through it and then routed to other websites. So they were a central contact, right? They were a central point. So if they go down, then that has a major downstream impact on all the websites where they are directing traffic to. So that's why you saw, the fallout from that was, websites like Amazon, like Netflix. These guys were impacted, right? And they suffered some level of downtime or slowage as a result of DIN getting hit with this attack. So, the bad guys out there have figured out that, there is a lack of inherent security. I think the biggest issue, for most people, most consumers anyway, is that your hardware or your router will come with a default password. There's very few people that actually change the default password on their router or on their monitors or other home devices, right, that are IoT enabled. So that becomes an issue, and that is sort of leading to this major problem around the security. And so predictions for 2017, IoT will continue to enable DDoS attacks against organizations. And so when we talk about some of the things that as risk managers we need to be aware of and we need to keep in mind, one of the major things is security by design, right, and privacy by design, which is, if I'm a manufacturer of this type of technology, obviously I'm going to want to embed security protocol from the ground up. So from the minute that somebody comes up with an idea, we sit down at the drawing board and we're coming up with the concept of a new product or a new service. Security has to be part of that conversation, and privacy needs to be part of that conversation. And if I'm a user of this type of technology, I want to make sure that I'm doing due diligence to make sure that that is the case, right, in the technology that I'm about to implement throughout my organization.
And with more and more businesses sort of outsourcing, particularly in this day and age, third-party risks, I would imagine, would be quite a big threat for a lot of businesses. But how easy is it to can reduce and manage third-party risks?
It's not easy. Right? It's really not an easy issue for any companies that are dealing with their providers at this stage, because a lot of what companies are reliant on now are contractual provisions that will help them, but those are reactive, right? So the issue has already occurred. It's just, what type of remediation do we have, and what kind of recourse might we have, against the provider, who in many cases is also a victim of the same attack. So we need to be sensitive about those types of things. But vetting the security and getting multiple stakeholders involved in looking at third-party providers and holding them to a standard that's very similar, if not more so, and greater than what you would hold yourself accountable for within the organization regarding security protocol and privacy risk management controls. Those are the things that should be included in the due diligence process and the vetting process when you're working with third-party providers and you're considering who you want to go with.
And just looking at that 15% minority, should that be higher, considering that a lot of these risks are interconnected and the kind of ultimate consequence is, a threat to your brand, a threat to your reputation? So should members be thinking more about how an attack arising from the Internet of Things could affect their reputation?
Yeah, well, I think if we look at the four elements here that we've picked out around security, we look at data integrity, reputation, and privacy, right? Each one of these elements, in my mind, feeds into the reputational impact. I don't know that it's necessary to think more seriously about it, because I think the challenge for a lot of companies is that this tends to be the most challenging area to quantify, right? And quantify the potential impact or the loss to the organization, because you look at it in a soft cost manner, whereas from a security perspective, I can tell you how much a forensic investigation might cost because I can measure the fees that I'm going to be charged. I can tell you what the cost of new technology looks like. Those are all hard costs. From a reputational perspective, it's going to be very difficult for me to quantify how many customers do I think I might lose over a period of time as a result of people's lack of confidence in dealing with my organization because something happened publicly where maybe I did not embed or I wasn't as careful as I should have been embedding IoT technology, and we had the best intentions for the original use, but something went sideways, and now that's out in the public, so that's going to have an impact on the reputation. So again, I don't know that I think everything feeds into the reputation, but it's a challenging area to quantify for the organization.
Brilliant.
Okay. So maybe just taking a quick look at some of these other areas. So around data integrity here, we're referring to the validity and the accuracy of data. So in looking at the risk associated with IoT, we have to first identify how data could be compromised, and then data integrity, we're looking at those situations, could be compromised by human error, whether that's malicious or unintentional. You have transfer errors that could occur, bugs or viruses. You have compromised hardware, and then you have physical compromise to actual devices. So the impact after all that could be economic. So what's the cost to the organization over time as a result of bad data and putting bad data into the mix? And then the operational impact. So what types of inefficiencies will lack of data integrity create for the organization? And what has that done to the initial investment then around IoT? So organizational impact is a key area of concern, and boards need to recognize that the investment in IoT can be completely wasted if data integrity is compromised. Not only does the organization lose the initial investment, but they also lose the ability to enhance the decision-making process and the R&D potentially around that. So in the scenarios involving personal devices like home monitoring systems that collect and feed data back to the service provider, bad data might cause a minor inconvenience in a best-case scenario for the end user, or at worst could cause some sort of bodily injury or physical damage to the property. In an industrial context, you could be looking at long-term leakage over time that results in direct loss through process inefficiencies. So ultimately, the initial investment in securing data and maintaining accuracy and integrity of that data, while could be potentially high, pays dividends in the ability to safely rely on that data to make decisions in the long term. It's important to communicate this to the board level folks when you're considering use of that type of technology. We talked a little bit already about the reputational element, so I won't go into much more detail there. But if we skip over then to privacy, for those of you who are based in the EU, the need to focus on privacy-related elements of technology will apply in this scenario. I mean, and I can't stress how important this is going to be going forward because of the impending changes to the Data Protection Directive, in that turning into a regulation come 2018. That will come into effect. And that's going to put more stress on the organization with regard to complying with the different elements, the new elements that are baked into that. And still, you need to be aware of the basic tenets of what that regulation and what the original directive was put in place for, which is protection of personal data and sensitive data, right, of individuals, and the privacy of that data. So you have to be cognizant of when you put IoT technology or embed IoT within the organization, what data is that actually collecting, right? Is it personal or sensitive, and is it considered personal or sensitive in terms of the regulation and the legislation? Where is that data at any given time? Do you know where it is? Does it use cloud as the back-end platform? Is the data relevant, right, in the immediate term to what you're doing? So do you have a purpose, right, in collecting that data? And then who is it being shared with? Because the purpose of IoT and pushing information back to a platform is obviously getting the benefit of massive data sets, but we need to be careful of what data actually goes into that and how it can be construed in the eyes of legislation. And then again, how does that match up with the new GDPR that's coming into effect in 2018? So those compliance and legal and regulatory issues, I think, are going to be at the forefront of elements that you need to be considered as risk managers. Okay. So just if we move on to the final slide here, I wanted to leave you, because we're almost at time, with the with just some practical takeaways. So we've talked a little bit about this already throughout the conversation, but cross-functional coordination and alignment within the organization, I think, is key. You have to make sure that, again, going back to this concept of privacy and security by design, and even once the product is out there, making sure that you have coordination between information technology, between security, between legal, compliance, and regulatory folks, between the design folks, the salespeople who are out there pushing the message, and then as risk managers, you need to be aware of how this technology actually works and what it does. And then again, we talked a little bit about privacy and security by design already, so you're familiar with the concept, but stressing again the importance of getting that security embedded if you are a provider of this type of technology, and then if you're a user, really going through the due diligence process to make sure that the service provider or the product manufacturer that you're working with has gone through a similar process there. You have to analyze the regulatory, the legal, and the compliance issues. Obviously, a heightened concern here going into 2018 with new requirements coming into play with the GDPR and around data collection. There's going to be a big impact on privacy, and there's also going to be some pretty big and stiff penalties for companies that are not compliant with that and those measures. So think hard about the use of technology and the data that it's collecting in that context. And then analyzing the risk of reliance on your service providers and then others in the supply chain relative to IoT. So you're going back to the DIN example, think about your reliance on third-party providers. What exactly are you relying on them for? Who do you consider your critical providers? And how pervasive is IoT technology throughout their organization to the point where it could have an impact downstream on your operation? And then really seeking board level engagement for investment in risk control measures around this. I think it's very important that the board has an idea of just how exposed the organization can be not only to first-party loss, but also potentially to third-party claims and regulatory issues that can crop up as a result of the use of this type of technology or the offering of this type of technology. So, hopefully this has given you a general idea really of what the Internet of Things is, the basics around how it works, and then some benefits, but also some of the risks associated with putting the technology into your organization.
Great, thank you, Tim. We do have one question here, and that's related to, I guess, comments around board engagement and an earlier comment around the fact that boards need to recognise the investment in the Internet of Things could potentially be wasted if data integrity is compromised. But I guess one of the main challenges for our members is around the cyber governance gap and getting buy-in from their boards and support from their boards around cyber-related risks and the risks related to the Internet of Things. How can that be improved, i.e. the risk manager forming that relationship at board level and getting their buy-in that actually, systems and processes need to be in place for managing a whole host of cyber-related risks, not just related to the Internet of Things, but to other digital transformation type technologies?
Yeah, I think, it's a great question, and one that, we often get in discussions with risk managers and with the C-level folks within these organizations who find it challenging, right, to show exactly what is the loss or the exposure to the organization going to be. So I'd tell you a couple things there. One of which would be to work with, there's a number of different standards out there right now, and standard setting agencies, and then different governmental entities that are coming to the forefront at the moment in imposing different standards. So you have basic cybersecurity standards here in the UK that are best practices and that would need to be implemented. Now, while those controls are, if an IT or a security individual were to look at them, say, these are very basic and we need to go beyond that realistically within our organization, what in effect they do is to create more awareness, right, among everyone within the organization. And that is something that I think you can use to push up and upwards to the board, is to say, look, this is not only something that is on our radar. It's not only an exposure that we're concerned with. This is an exposure that the government is concerned with, and the government is concerned that companies are not doing enough at the moment to protect information. So that would be primarily the area that I would say you should push within the organization. And then the other element too is, I don't want this to be a commercial, obviously, for insurance companies or the vendors that operate in the space, but I would frame it in this manner, that you do have access now to a lot more benchmarking information than existed only 5 years ago, or even 2 years ago for that matter. And there are a lot of organizations out there that can help you in a consulting capacity, or even as part of a proposal, right, or an application process in looking at an insurance company, to give you access to tools that will help you quantify potential exposures around cyber risk. Right? And that not only includes liability and the regulatory element, but also first-party elements as well. So, what potentially could my business interruption loss look like over a period of 180 days, or a full year if we were to go down, or we just had reduced capacity of our network? What impact would that have on our ability to generate income over that period of time? What kind of extra expenses or increased cost of working would we actually incur as a result of that situation? What's the potential liability based on the litigation environment in my country or my jurisdiction? And what are the regulatory fines and penalty structure that would exist? There are a lot of resources out there at the moment that can help you overlay that information onto your organization and get a better gauge that you can use then to message up to the board. So I'd say between the increasing awareness of government in many different jurisdictions, and then access to some of the tools that you might have out there that exist at the moment that take advantage of the fact that there's more data floating around around these issues, I think, are two of the main areas that I would stress to say, that's how you can get information into and stress the importance to your board.
Great, thank you, Tim. We do have one other question. It's a request really for more information about blockchain, and I suppose in this webinar we don't have the space to go into detail about blockchain, but perhaps if you could maybe talk around the main points that members should consider with regards to blockchain.
I'm looking at Ken saying blockchain. So, so blockchain. Let me qualify. I'm not a technician. Okay, so I won't be able to give you the ins and outs of blockchain technology. So I'd say let's save that one for another webinar.
Good call.
All right.
Great. So thank you very much for your inputs. This webinar will be available on the AMIC website, and the web address is on your screens just now. The next webinar will take place next week, and that is looking at big data. Freddie Linhart from Swiss Re Corporate Solutions will be making that presentation. If you haven't registered for that webinar, please do so by following the link on your screens now. Thank you very much for your for joining us, and I hope you enjoyed the webinar.